9. Margie Velma Barfield. The coffee smelled different that morning, but Stuart Taylor didn't think much of it as he sat across from the woman he planned to marry. Velma stirred her own cup with practiced calm, watching as Stuart brought the poisoned brew to his lips. She had done this before. The rat poison dissolved so easily into hot liquid, and men trusted the women who claimed to love them. Stuart was a farmer who believed he had found companionship in his golden years with Velma, a widow who seemed to share his simple pleasures and quiet faith. What he couldn't see was a predator sitting across his kitchen table, a woman who had already killed her own mother and was now calculating how long it would take him to die. The arsenic would work its way through his system slowly, mimicking a heart condition that would fool doctors and leave Velma free to collect whatever money he had saved. North Carolina in 1978 seemed like the kind of place where neighbors looked out for each other, where church-going women like Velma represented safety and tradition. But behind her modest dresses and soft-spoken manner lived something that defied every assumption about maternal instinct and feminine gentleness. She had transformed her kitchen into a laboratory of death, her cooking into a weapon more dangerous than any gun. The pattern had started years earlier with her husband Thomas, whose mysterious illness and eventual death had left Velma free to pursue other relationships. Then came Montgomery Edwards, an elderly man who made the mistake of caring about her, followed by John Henry Lee, another potential husband who discovered too late that Velma's affection came with a price. Each time, the symptoms were the same: stomach pain, weakness, vomiting, and then the final collapse that doctors attributed to natural causes. But it was the murder of her own mother, Lily Bullard, that revealed the true depths of Velma's depravity. The woman who had given her life, who had cared for her through childhood and supported her through difficulties, became just another obstacle to be eliminated. Velma fed her mother the same poison she used on her victims, watching the elderly woman suffer and die while maintaining performance of a grieving daughter. The investigation that finally exposed Velma began when Stuart Taylor's family refused to accept the official cause of his death. They demanded an autopsy, and what toxicologists found changed everything. Stuart's body contained lethal levels of arsenic, and when authorities exhumed other recent victims, they discovered the same poison in corpse after corpse. Velma had been operating a one-woman extermination business, using relationships as cover for a methodical elimination campaign. During questioning, Velma initially denied everything, playing the role of shocked widow who couldn't understand why anyone would suspect her of such things. But when faced with overwhelming physical evidence, when confronted with testimony from witnesses who had seen her purchasing rat poison, when cornered by the mathematical impossibility of so many people dying around her by coincidence, she finally confessed to the poisoning spree that had claimed multiple lives. The trial revealed not just the mechanics of her crimes, but the chilling psychology behind them. Velma had killed for small amounts of money, for insurance payouts that barely covered funeral expenses, for the simple convenience of eliminating people who had become inconvenient. She showed no remorse for her mother's death, no grief for the men who had trusted her with their lives, no recognition that she had violated every principle of human decency. On March 30th, 1984, Velma Barfield became the first woman executed in the United States after the reinstatement of capital punishment. At 66 years old, she walked into the death chamber at Central Prison in Raleigh, still maintaining that she deserved forgiveness rather than lethal injection. The needle entered her arm at 2 a.m., delivering the drugs that would stop her heart within minutes. She died as she had lived in her final years, surrounded by attention, but utterly alone in her guilt. 10. Janie Lou Gibbs. Sunday services at the Baptist Church knew Janie Lou as a woman in the front pew, Bible clutched against her chest, voice raised in hymns about salvation and grace. Her neighbors in Cordele, Georgia, saw a devoted wife and mother, someone who cooked Sunday dinners and visited the sick and never missed an opportunity to speak about her faith in the Lord. What they didn't see was a woman who came home from church and reached for the ant poison hidden in her kitchen cabinet. The Gibbs household seemed blessed with prosperity and happiness until death began visiting with unusual frequency. First it was Charlie, Janie Lou's husband of 23 years, who developed mysterious stomach ailments that doctors couldn't explain. He would double over in pain after family meals, vomiting until he was too weak to stand, his body slowly shutting down as arsenic accumulated in his organs. Jannie Lou nursed him tenderly through each episode, bringing him soup and tea that contained increasing doses of the poison that was killing him. When Charlie died in 1966, the community rallied around the grieving widow, bringing casseroles and offering support to a woman who seemed devastated by her loss. The insurance money helped ease her financial burdens, but it wasn't enough to satisfy whatever had awakened in Jannie Lou's heart. The act of killing had unlocked something that prayer couldn't contain, a hunger for control over life and death that made her feel more powerful than any sermon ever had. Her next victim was her own flesh and blood. Marvin, her eldest son, began experiencing the same symptoms that had killed his father. The 23-year-old had his whole life ahead of him, plans for marriage and career that would never come to fruition because his mother decided he was worth more dead than alive. She fed him arsenic-laced meals while weeping about his condition to neighbors, playing the role of concerned mother while systematically murdering her own child. The poisonings continued with mechanical precision. Roger, another son, succumbed to the same mysterious illness that had claimed his father and brother. Melvin, the youngest boy, followed the same agonizing path to death, his teenage body unable to process the poison his mother spooned into his food day after day. Each funeral saw Jannie Lou surrounded by supportive church members. Each burial brought another insurance payout. Each death made it easier for her to kill again. The final victim was the most innocent of all, 13-year-old grandson Carl, who had come to live with grandmother Jannie Lou after his father's death. The boy trusted her completely, calling her grandmama with the kind of affection that should have protected him from harm. Instead, it made him an easier target for a woman who saw even children as disposable when they stood between her and financial gain. The investigation that finally exposed Jannie Lou began when family members started questioning the string of deaths that had decimated the Gibbs family. Too many people were dying of similar symptoms. Too many insurance policies were being collected by the same woman. Too many coincidences were piling up for comfort. When authorities ordered exhumations and toxicology tests, they discovered arsenic levels that could only have come from deliberate poisoning. Jannie Lou's arrest shocked a community that had known her as a pillar of Christian faith and family values. The woman who had taught Sunday school and organized church suppers was revealed as a serial killer who had murdered her own family for insurance money. The cognitive dissonance was so extreme that some neighbors continued to defend her even after her confession, unable to reconcile the murder with the godly woman they thought they knew. During the trial, prosecutors laid out the timeline of deaths and the financial motives behind each murder. They showed how Jannie Lou had purchased arsenic, how she had administered it, how she had collected insurance money after each death. The defense tried to argue mental illness, but the evidence showed careful planning and deliberate action over several years. The jury convicted her of multiple counts of murder, and she received multiple life sentences that ensured she would never again have the opportunity to poison anyone. Jannie Lou Gibbs died in prison in 1999, having spent 30 years behind bars for murders of her husband, 3 sons, and grandson. She had claimed to be doing God's work throughout her life, but her final years were spent in a concrete cell, cut off from the church community that had once embraced her as one of their most devout members. 11. Dorothy Williams. The needle sliding into Dorothy's arm brought more than heroin into her bloodstream. It carried the promise of temporary escape from a reality where killing elderly people had become as routine as breathing. By 1980, Dorothy Williams had transformed the streets of Chicago into her personal hunting ground, where senior citizens represented walking ATMs that she could empty with violence and abandon without conscience. Her victims never saw her coming. 80-year-old women walking home from grocery stores, elderly men struggling with canes down quiet sidewalks, seniors whose only crime was existing in Dorothy's vicinity when her addiction demanded feeding. She would approach them with requests for directions or help, her voice friendly enough to lower their defenses, her manner ordinary enough to mask the predator calculating their worth in drug money. The robberies began simply enough. Purse snatchings that escalated when victims resisted or moved too slowly for Dorothy's impatience. But somewhere in a haze of withdrawal and desperation, simple theft became something darker. The elderly woman who wouldn't let go of her handbag found Dorothy's hands around her throat. The old man who tried to call for help discovered what Dorothy's fists could do to fragile bones and aging skin. Violence became Dorothy's signature, her calling card in a series of crimes that terrorized Chicago's senior community throughout the late 1970s. She didn't just rob her victims. She punished them for being vulnerable, for having money she needed, for existing in a world where she felt powerless. The brutality was excessive, unnecessary, driven by rage that went far beyond the requirements of simple theft. Each attack grew more vicious than the last. Dorothy would beat victims unconscious even after they had surrendered their money, continuing the assault long after any practical purpose had been served. She seemed to enjoy the fear in their eyes, the pleading in their voices, the way they begged for mercy from someone who had none to give. The heroine might have started the cycle, but something else was driving the escalating savagery of her crimes. The murder that finally put Dorothy on death row occurred during what should have been a routine robbery. 73-year-old Evelyn Williams was walking home from the bank when Dorothy spotted her as an easy target. The attack began like all the others, with demands for money and threats of violence. But this time, Dorothy didn't stop when the elderly woman handed over her purse. This time, the beating continued until Evelyn Williams lay die on the sidewalk, her skull fractured, her life bleeding away while Dorothy rifled through her belongings for drug money. The investigation into Evelyn's murder revealed the full scope of Dorothy's crime spree. Witness descriptions matched previous attacks. Physical evidence linked her to multiple robberies, and her own admissions filled in the gaps that forensic science couldn't complete. The pattern was clear. Dorothy Williams had been systematically hunting elderly victims throughout Chicago, leaving a trail of traumatized survivors and, finally, one dead woman whose family would never see justice served. During the trial, the prosecution presented evidence of Dorothy's methodical targeting of vulnerable victims, her escalating use of violence, and her complete lack of remorse for the pain she had inflicted. Defense attorneys argued that heroin addiction had compromised her judgment, that she was driven by desperation rather than malice. But the evidence showed planning, selection of victims, and brutality that went far beyond the requirements of feeding an addiction. The jury heard testimony from survivors who described Dorothy's cold efficiency during robberies, her willingness to inflict pain even when victims cooperated, her apparent enjoyment of their terror and helplessness. Medical testimony revealed the extent of injuries suffered by her victims, including broken bones, internal bleeding, and psychological trauma that lasted long after physical wounds had healed. On October 10, 1986, Dorothy Williams became the first African-American woman sentenced to death in Illinois since the reinstatement of capital punishment. She was 35 years old when she received her death sentence, and she spent the next 14 years on death row at Dwight Correctional Center. Her appeals gradually exhausted as courts found her conviction and sentence appropriate for someone who had terrorized elderly victims throughout Chicago. Dorothy died of natural causes on death row in 2000. Her execution never carried out due to Illinois' eventual moratorium on capital punishment. Her death in prison ended a life that had been defined by addiction, violence, and the systematic victimization of people who deserve protection rather than predation. 12. Angela Simpson. The disability check that Phoenix, Arizona resident Terry Neely received each month represented his lifeline to independence. Money that allowed him to maintain his own apartment, buy his own food, and live with the dignity that every person deserves regardless of their mental limitations. What Terry couldn't understand was that Angela Simpson saw those checks differently. To her, his monthly income represented an opportunity, and Terry himself was nothing more than an obstacle standing between her and easy money. Angela had cultivated a relationship with Terry over several months, presenting herself as a friend who cared about his well-being and understood his struggles with mental disability. She would visit his apartment regularly, helping him with errands and tasks that were difficult for him to manage alone. Terry was grateful for the attention and assistance, never suspecting that Angela was studying his routines, learning his vulnerabilities, and planning something that would shock even hardened police investigators. On August 6, 2009, Angela decided that Terry had outlived his usefulness. But instead of simply killing him quickly and taking what she wanted, she chose to make his death an extended torture session that revealed depth of cruelty that most people couldn't imagine. She didn't just want Terry dead. She wanted him to suffer, to pay for being different, to experience pain that matched her own twisted sense of what he deserved for existing. The torture began with beatings that broke bones and ruptured internal organs. Angela used hammers and other tools to inflict maximum damage, while keeping Terry conscious enough to feel every blow. She burned him with heated objects, carved into his skin with knives, and inflicted injuries that would have been fatal individually, but were carefully calibrated to prolong his agony for hours. When Terry's screams became too loud, Angela stuffed his mouth with cloth and tape. Ensuring that neighbors wouldn't hear what was happening in the apartment they thought belonged to a quiet, harmless man. She wanted him to know that no one was coming to help him, that she had complete control over his life and death, that his disability made him powerless against someone who had chosen him specifically because of his vulnerability. The most disturbing aspect of Terry's murder wasn't just a physical torture, but Angela's psychological cruelty. She taunted him about his disability, told him that no one would miss him, made him understand that she was killing him not for money, but because she enjoyed watching him suffer. She recorded parts of the torture on her phone, creating souvenirs of her victim's agony that she could replay whenever she wanted to relive the experience. After hours of torture, Angela finally allowed Terry to die. But even then, she wasn't finished with him. She mutilated his corpse, removing body parts that she would later use to further torment his memory. She took photographs of his remains, creating a visual record of her work that she would show to friends and acquaintances with pride rather than shame. When police finally discovered Terry's body, the crime scene was so disturbing that veteran investigators required counseling to process what they had witnessed. The apartment told a story of prolonged torture, of someone who had taken pleasure in inflicting maximum suffering on a defenseless victim. Physical evidence, photographs, and Angela's own admissions painted a picture of cruelty that challenged basic assumptions about human nature. During her trial, Angela showed no remorse for what she had done to Terry. In fact, she seemed proud of her actions, describing the torture in detail and explaining her motivations with the casual tone someone might use to discuss the weather. She told the court that Terry had deserved what happened to him, that disabled people were burdens on society, that she had done everyone a favor by eliminating him. The jury heard testimony about Terry's life before meeting Angela, his struggles with disability, his efforts to live independently, his trust in someone who had presented herself as a friend. They learned about his final hours, about the pain he had endured, about how he had died begging for mercy from someone who had none to give. The evidence was so overwhelming and disturbing that deliberations took less than 2 hours. On June 27, 2017, Angela Simpson was sentenced to death for the torture and murder of Terry Neely. She was 49 years old when she received her death sentence, and she showed no emotion as the judge pronounced her fate. She remains on death row at the Perryville Women's Prison in Arizona, where she continues to express pride in her crimes and shows no remorse for torturing a disabled man to death for his disability checks. 13. Virginia Christian. The year 1912 found 16-year-old Virginia Christian scrubbing floors in Hampton, Virginia, her dark hands moving across white marble that would never truly be clean enough for the woman who employed her. Ida Bellotti demanded perfection from her domestic staff, particularly from the young black girl, whose very presence in her home represented both necessity and annoyance. Virginia's youth should have protected her from the harshest treatment, but in the Jim Crow South, age provided no shield against the casual cruelty of employers who saw their servants as property rather than people. The Bellotti household operated according to rules that Virginia learned through painful experience rather than gentle instruction. She rose before dawn to prepare breakfast, spent her days cleaning rooms that seemed designed to highlight every speck of dust, and retired long after the family had settled into comfortable beds that she would never be allowed to sleep in. The wages she earned, when Ida Bellotti remembered to pay them, barely covered her basic needs. But employment was scarce for young black women in a society that offered them few choices beyond domestic service or destitution. What happened on the morning of March 18, 1912, depends on whose version of events you choose to believe. According to Virginia's later testimony, Ida Bellotti had been particularly harsh that day, berating her for imagined failures and threatening to dock her already meager pay for work that met the same standards that had been acceptable the previous week. The tension that had been building for months finally reached a breaking point when Bellotti raised her hand to strike the teenager who had been enduring abuse in silence. The physical confrontation that followed lasted only minutes, but its consequences would echo through legal history for more than a century. Virginia later claimed she had acted in self-defense when Bellotti attacked her with a kitchen implement, that the older woman's death had been accidental rather than intentional, that she had never meant to kill her employer, but only to protect herself from another beating. The prosecution would argue something entirely different, that Virginia had murdered Bellotti in a fit of rage, that the killing had been deliberate and unprovoked, that the teenager deserved to pay with her life for taking the life of a white woman. The investigation that followed Bellotti's death reflected all the prejudices and assumptions of early 20th century Virginia. Police officers who might look more carefully for evidence of abuse and other circumstances saw only a dead white woman and a black teenager who must be guilty of something. The possibility that Virginia had been defending herself from attack, that Bellotti had a history of violence against her domestic workers, that the power dynamics of the household had created conditions where tragedy was inevitable. These considerations never received serious attention from authorities more interested in swift justice than accurate justice. Virginia's trial became a spectacle that attracted attention throughout Virginia and beyond. Newspapers covered the proceedings with the kind of sensational language typically reserved for the most notorious criminals, describing the teenage defendant in terms that emphasized her race and youth, while painting Bellotti as an innocent victim of unprovoked violence. The all-white, all-male jury that would decide Virginia's fate heard testimony designed to confirm their existing prejudices rather than challenge them to consider the complex circumstances that had led to tragedy. The defense attorney assigned to represent Virginia faced an impossible task in a legal system that had been designed to protect white interests at the expense of black lives. He attempted to argue that Virginia had acted in self-defense, that her youth and inexperience should mitigate her punishment, that the circumstances of her employment had created conditions where violence was tragically inevitable. But his arguments fell on deaf ears in a courtroom where the outcome had been predetermined by social expectations rather than legal evidence. The prosecution's case relied heavily on the assumption that domestic servants had no right to resist their employer's authority, regardless of how that authority was exercised. They portrayed Virginia as an ungrateful employee who had repaid Bellotti's kindness with murder, ignoring evidence that might have supported claims of abuse or self-defense. The jury heard what they expected to hear, a story about black criminality and white victimhood that confirmed their existing beliefs about racial hierarchy and social order. When the jury returned their verdict after less than 2 hours of deliberation, they had decided not just Virginia's fate, but the fate of a legal principle that would haunt American justice for generations. Their finding of guilty represented more than individual accountability. It reflected a legal system's willingness to sacrifice young black lives to maintain white authority, to ignore evidence of abuse when conflicted with social expectations, to treat children as adults when doing so served the interests of white supremacy. The death sentence that followed Virginia's conviction shocked even some observers who had expected harsh punishment. At 16 years old, she became the youngest person ever sentenced to death in Virginia, a distinction that highlighted the particular vulnerability of black youth in a legal system that offered them no protection from adult consequences. Appeals filed on her behalf argued that executing a teenager violated both legal precedent and basic human decency, but courts rejected these arguments with the same casual indifference that had characterized her original trial. Virginia Christian died in the electric chair at the Virginia State Penitentiary on August 16, 1912, becoming the youngest female ever executed in American history. She was just 17 years old when the current coursed through her body, ending a life that had been defined by poverty, abuse, and the kind of systematic injustice that would continue claiming young black lives for decades to come. Her execution represented not just individual tragedy but collective failure, a society's willingness to kill children rather than examine conditions that had created the circumstances leading to their crimes. The legacy of Virginia's case extends far beyond the specific circumstances of her death to encompass broader questions about juvenile justice, racial equity, and the death penalty that continue challenging American legal system today. Her story serves as a reminder that the youngest and most vulnerable members of society deserve protection rather than punishment, that age and circumstances matter when determining appropriate consequences for criminal behavior, that executing children represents a fundamental violation of human dignity that no legal system should tolerate. 14. Carlette Parker. Carlette Parker was not a woman who stood out in the crowd. Neighbors in Durham, North Carolina, described her as quiet, even polite. She worked as a nurse's aide, slipped in and out of her small apartment, and never drew attention to herself. But behind the unremarkable exterior lurked something chilling. She wasn't just blending in. She was hiding in plain sight. Her story begins with whispers of kindness. Patients recalled her gentle voice and careful touch. Co-workers said she carried herself with patience, the type of person you might trust with your child or your aging mother. But trust was a camouflage. She knew that to hurt others without being suspected, she needed to become invisible in their eyes first. And that's exactly what she did. The quietness was a mask, one she wore effortlessly, until the mask cracked. And when it did, the truth was uglier than anyone could have imagined. The middle of Carlette's tale is where it turns from strange to unforgettable. It was the night she killed her boyfriend, Wilbur Johnson, the man who thought he knew her, who believed she was just another woman struggling to make ends meet, had no idea that jealousy and rage were fermenting beneath her calm skin. That night, the walls of her apartment became a stage for cruelty. Wilbur was overpowered, forced into a bathtub where Carlette held him under the water. She didn't strike with a weapon or lash out in a frenzy. Instead, she chose silence as her blade, suffocating his life slowly, deliberately, as if savoring control with every passing second. The chilling part wasn't just that Wilbur drowned. It was what Carlette did afterward. Instead of breaking down in grief or panic, she went cold, calculated. She dragged his body, wrapped it tight in a comforter, and stuffed it into the trunk of the car as if it were nothing more than baggage she was discarding. No prayers, no apologies, just the stillness of a woman who had crossed a line and wasn't looking back. When police traced the disappearance, Carlette tried weaving lies. She played the worried girlfriend, insisting she had no idea where Wilbur had gone. But evidence always whispers the truth. Fibers, fingerprints, and inconsistencies build up until the silence she tried to hide behind collapsed. Her calm demeanor shattered under questioning, exposing a darker woman than anyone had suspected. The courtroom became her new stage. Prosecutors revealed not just murder, but a chilling pattern. Carlette wasn't fueled by desperation alone. She had something deeper coursing through her, a need to control, to dominate, to snuff out those who crossed her. Wilbert's death wasn't an accident, nor a heat-of-the-moment mistake. It was deliberate. Witnesses recounted the way she spoke about him in the weeks leading up to the killing, cold, detached, as if she were rehearsing her break from him long before the act. And when the jury looked at her, they didn't see grief or guilt. They saw a woman sitting stone-faced, as if nothing weighed on her conscience. That absence of remorse chilled everyone in the room. The verdict was swift. Carlette Parker was found guilty of murder and sentenced to spend the rest of her days locked away. Not a fleeting punishment, not a second chance. A life behind concrete walls and razor wire. Today, Carlette remains a shadowed figure in the prison system. She isn't the loudest inmate. She doesn't stir fights or draw headlines. Instead, she lingers like an echo of the crime that marked her forever. The woman who once passed as invisible now lives a life where every move is observed, every door locked tight against her. But Wilbur Johnson's story ends differently. His name faded from the headlines. His family left to grieve a man whose trust cost him his life. The memory of his final moments, trapped, struggling, submerged, still lingers as the most haunting chapter of Carlette Parker's legacy. Because when the mask of quietness finally fell away, it revealed a predator hiding in plain sight.